Welcome to the first Nex Gen podcast series produced by the LIDC, Ligue internationale du droit de la concurrence, International League of Competition Law. Throughout a series of 7 episodes, our expert guests will explore the intersection of competition law with emerging technologies like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, and will delve into the legal, economic, and policy challenges these innovations pose to competition regulation worldwide. All the views expressed throughout this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the views of the LIDC nor any of the companies and organizations with whom the speakers may be affiliated or the clients they represent.
So it's a pleasure to welcome you to the second podcast in this series on competition in cloud and AI. In the previous podcast, we discussed the status quo. So we were looking at what we mean by the AI stack, and we were thinking just at a very broad, high level about some of the competition concerns that arise at each of the layers. And in this session, we're going to think about some alternative visions to that status quo. So we're going to discuss in particular the emergent Euro stack approach, and we're going to also compare with approaches from different international jurisdictions, and we're privileged to have some real expertise on the table on this. So if I just make a few kind of scene-setting comments, which really kind of come from an observation that I have, which is that I guess what's happening now with the Eurostack approach that Shruti will kind of go into in more depth is we're kind of seeing a transition away from a kind of an EU regulatory approach that was very much either sector-focused or let's say firm-focused. So we have examples of that with the DMA. It's essentially designed to regulate a very small subset of digital firms, so-called gatekeeper firms. The Data Act is really homing in on IoT, Internet of Things, and related service providers and cloud providers. And what we're seeing with this Eurostack approach is actually a little bit of a broader perhaps more of an ambitious approach where we're moving away from that sector-specific, firm-specific, tweaking with fairness or contestability on the margins approach, moving to something far more informed by ambitious industrial policy. I think that's very interesting indeed. And so what I guess we'll discuss is something that I think is really important to get to the nitty-gritty of here, which is this idea of a digital public infrastructure. And I think they come in a variety of forms. I think they come in, if we can brand them as light and then full, and something in between. And it's interesting. Shruti again will unpack what we mean by this and give some very interesting examples. But just initially, at a high level, what I think is interesting is that with this shift away from reliance, let's call it, on big tech infrastructure, we're seeing nations that maybe surprise us. We're seeing developing nations. India, Brazil particularly are interesting examples that are actually leading the way in this area, perhaps heading more to the full than the light approach, which is fascinating. By light, I mean, again, an around the edges kind of approach, something small to do with payments or something small to do with a sector. What we're talking about, I think, with Eurostack and what we're talking about with digital public infrastructure is nations deciding that they want to take control, they take sovereignty over key aspects of the stack. And so if I can hand over to Shruti to go into that in a little bit more detail.
Sure, thanks, Ben. So just picking up from where you were, so the Eurostack really refers to Europe's strategic initiative to develop independent digital infrastructure across all levels of the AI stack we were talking about earlier. So cloud computing, chips, AI, digital identities, data spaces, and also payment systems. The idea behind this initiative is to reduce reliance on non-European technologies and enhance digital sovereignty, as Ben was saying. And I think there are some interesting examples from India where this approach has actually helped promote significant competition. And it might be it might be good to think about those examples when thinking about, is regulation really necessary, more regulation really necessary, the right approach to solving a problem, or are there alternatives out there? And I think India is a good example of how digital public infrastructure has actually enabled significant competition in financial services. And the example in financial services is something called UPI, or the Unified Payments Interface in India. That is an open API framework that allows banks and fintech companies to develop applications without building the backend infrastructure. So all of the backend infrastructure is public, and any startup or big company for that matter that wants to develop an application can just plug into that existing API framework and build their application. So in the financial services context, the other advantage that offers is that a startup does not need to be linked to a particular bank in order to offer it the service that it wants to offer. It can just plug into this sort of existing digital public infrastructure. And so what we've seen as a result of that in India is that as of 2024, over 300 banks and numerous third-party apps today utilize UPI, and therefore that has promoted a lot of competition and consumer choice. So you have startups like PhonePe, Paytm, etc. coming up. These are companies that didn't exist before. But you also have companies like Google who have built their Google Pay infrastructure, linked their Google Pay in India to the UPI infrastructure. So you can see how both startups and existing companies and big companies can use digital public infrastructure to offer consumers more choice. Another interesting example, I think, is the Open Network for Digital Commerce, or the ONDC. And the ONDC is an open network infrastructure that connects buyers and sellers across different platforms by offering certain standardized protocols. So we all shop on online marketplaces, but this is a digital public infrastructure offering a marketplace, so to speak. So it's connecting different buyers and different sellers on without them then having to sign up to one marketplace or another. And so what that does is take away the need for, especially for smaller companies, to have to spend large amounts of money building that infrastructure in the background. And then from a consumer perspective, that of course also means that they get more choice, maybe better prices. So I think these are some interesting examples that show that how digital public infrastructure can actually significantly promote competition, and regulation is not always the only way to do this. But Laura, interested to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I think the Eurostack for me has kind of come out and just recognised what, as someone who's done a decade of privacy law, has been seeing as a trend for the past 10 years, which is that we've been attempting to utilise privacy as a lot of other things beyond just protecting privacy harms. So culturally, a lot of countries have taken different approaches to privacy. So one is, definitely with China, and I would say APAC generally, so Australia and Singapore in that bucket, definitely use privacy regulation as a way to talk more about national security data and making sure we're locking down the data and keeping it within the country. And then, you've got in Europe, they were doing a similar thing around transatlantic data flows. And then, the US has been much more open about data and wanting like a broader privacy framework because that allows US companies to utilize the data in other ways. And I think finally with the Eurostack, it's this recognition that, hang on, it's not just data that we're talking about. It's certainly not just personal information we're talking about. We're talking about competition across the whole stack, and infrastructure is key to that, as is data. And so I do like the approach, and also I do like the fact that we've moved beyond sector-specific approaches, because I found them incredibly frustrating from a data perspective, because you had standards in telco that wouldn't talk to standards in banking, which really impacted the ways that you can share data. But I do think on the public infrastructure point, there's definitely a place for open infrastructure. But my question, I guess, more for you guys as the competition experts is, competition. So the governments can do two things. You regulate to increase competition, or you create infrastructure that can create competition. And my concern working for a lot of innovative R&D heavy companies is when the government steps in and does infrastructure, the question to me is that taking the opportunities away from innovative companies? And what I have seen in particular in the data space is governments aren't necessarily trusted with data infrastructure. I don't want to give all of my data to the government to know exactly how my business operates. I don't want them to have a profile like Facebook does on me, on my business. And so I do think there is a place for closed and proprietary systems and infrastructure to operate as well. And it's just, where is the government's investment best made in terms of regulatory support, incentives, fundings, subsidies, or building it themselves?
Yeah, and Lauren, just to quickly comment on that point, I completely agree with you that I think the best way this would promote competition is if it's an alternative to anything offered, some similar services offered by private companies, rather than forcing everyone to basically use the digital public infrastructure. And actually the examples I've given in India are just that. So, the ONDC is not, just because the ONDC exists, it does not mean an Amazon or, one of the popular online marketplaces in India, Flipkart or Myntra or some of these other ones can't exist as well. They all exist alongside. So it's just giving an alternative for someone who does not want to go to any of those other platforms.
Which is where I see the big difference with like open banking, right? Where it's mandatory not only for you to build the infrastructure, but also to share the data that's been designated. And to me, the problem there is, well, if it wasn't being shared, why wasn't it being shared? Was it because they didn't have the infrastructure, or was it because there weren't the incentives and the value there to share the data? And I think that is the place that we needed to start, rather than starting at the infrastructure level.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And maybe stepping back, one of the motivations for these types of interventions by governments is a feeling that there is a bit of an internet empire, which has been created largely by countries from one company, from one country, and that's very much in the interests of that origin country, I think, but it's not necessarily been equally in the interests of all the other countries and jurisdictions. And that leads to a response a bit perhaps like we've seen in Europe, which is more of a desire to have industrial policy than there has been in the past. And this type of creation of alternatives is one facet of industrial policy that is maybe less directive in a way than some of the alternatives. And so I'm very interested and curious to see the developments we'll have in Europe over the next years, especially with this new commission that's just been appointed in light of the Draghi report and other reports that have been encouraging more active industrial policy and intervention, because it's not obvious. If you do think there is an internet empire, which I've written about, by the way, in a book, that it's not obvious how to react to that
Yeah.
as a government. And I think maybe many of the reactions ultimately that are most valuable for competition are about how individuals respond and individual incentives to change. And it's very much an open question what's going to happen there in the next years.
Absolutely. I think reflecting on this, there's a danger that, in particular, Europe may be having a negative reaction to this so-called internet empire, but that sovereignty is really, pulling up the ramparts is really, from a competition perspective, the wrong approach. As far as I'm concerned, I think there are real risks involved with that. Where you have a digital public infrastructure that is a genuine alternative and it can compete on the merits with private firms from any jurisdiction, then I think you're getting to a place with healthy competition. And I suppose there are maybe certain people in Europe who might also reflect on the election in America, where there might be a response, and you can already feel it online through certain channels, that there are some people who are responding to this and perhaps feeling that, pulling up the doors and closing the doors to the United States of America is something that Europe should do. I would say that would be the most foolish possible reaction. If we also think about, the point that Sean made actually in the first podcast recording of this series about investments, the reality is that Europe is benefiting enormously in terms of capital investment, in terms of obviously this investment in jobs, in skills that is being driven by a small subset of US firms. But if you just sort of sever ties and go on a sovereignty kind of banner, then I think there are real risks. I suppose that it very much balanced. There are clearly tremendous merits, but as Lauren says, do you want the government to be doing everything? Perhaps the adage of the words that put the most fear into someone is "there's a man from the government at the door and he's here to help." Maybe that's an exaggeration, but there's definitely a balance to be struck there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Nex Gen podcast by LIDC. To stay up to date with future episodes, we invite you to visit the LIDC website and subscribe to this channel. We look forward to having you with us again soon.